You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. Gentlemen, welcome back to Starfleet headquarters. We are talking today, probably the most famous, I think we could say, Star Trek episode of any series of all time. As a matter of fact, so famous that a later Star Trek series, Deep Space Nine, revisited this episode. And the latest Star Trek Picard season even touched upon this episode in a fairly unique and somewhat horrific way. And of course, I don't think we even have to mention its name for folks to know immediately what we're talking about. But we are, of course, talking The Trouble with Tribbles. Again, I think this episode transcends time and space when it comes to fame and being ubiquitous amongst really just TV fans. You don't even have to be a Star Trek fan, sci-fi fan to know this episode. Certainly The Simpsons and every other show out there has borrowed some premise or portion of this for its comedy or humor or really anything, because it is just that groundbreaking of a television episode. But I needn't say too much more because Fert Derby's got some very interesting background. I can't wait to hear about it. Take us away, Fert Derby, Warp Factor 3.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks, Trekkies, for hanging in with us and all of our Tribbles. We are indeed on The Trouble with Tribbles. That was the last present Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry gave to fans for the year 1967. This one aired on December 29th, just 2 days before we hit 68. Longtime returning champion Joseph Pevney is our director, and David Gerald is our writer. And we're going to go a little bit into his background and the background of the creation of this episode because it's fun. David Gerald, the writer, was born in Chicago, Illinois. And he saw the man trap, which we discussed in our very first or second first season Trek on the Warp Core. And you're going to want to make sure that you check out our man trap reaction. It was one of my favorites of season one. Definitely click on that subscribe button and check out our archives. Anyways, David Gerald was just sitting on his couch as a 22-year-old from Chicago, Illinois, when he watched the Man Trap premiere on September 8th, 1966, and he was dazzled by this brand new science fiction television series put on the air by Desilu and Paramount. He was so much, he ran to his room and he wrote a 60-page, two-part outline of an episode, coincidentally called Tomorrow Was Yesterday, not knowing that later on in the first season they would have Tomorrow Is Yesterday, which had nothing to do with David Gerald's 60-page, two-part outline. He sent that in to the producers of Star Trek, and Gene L. Kuhn, showrunner, took a look at it, and he liked it. But it was a 60-page, two-part outline, and so he said he had to reject it because they never could have filmed what David Gerald had rushed upstairs to his bedroom and typed out on a network TV budget. But he saw a lot of potential, and he was impressed with Gerald's, initial attempts. And so he invited him to submit 5 additional storylines without the promise that any of them would ever see the light of day. But he said, hey, we can't really do this one, but if you've got more ideas, you can submit up to 5. Well, David Gerald naturally took the bait, and he sent him 5 more typed premises, not 60 pages long. And for various reasons, because some of them were similar to things that were already in the pipeline, like the Doomsday Machine, and for other reasons. 4 of those 5 were not recommended by dentists whose patients chew gum. But the 5th one, something that he had called the fuzzies, was initially rejected by Kuhn. He went a clean 5 for 5. No, we can't make these. But the fuzzies stayed with Gene Kuhn, and he changed his mind, which is rare in Hollywood in these circumstances. He later said, you know what, we might be able to do something with that. So it was initially, the idea was based on introducing wild rabbits in Australia in the year 1859, and they bred too fast and they overran Australia at the time, and that was where Gerald drew his inspiration. And it was also deliberately intended, and we've said in our past Warp Cores that some Star Trek episodes bordered on camp. Some of them, tried to go for a lighter touch, mixed results. This one was always intended to be sort of a comic undertaking, a comedy forward episode, if you will. That was always the intention from the jump. So he pitched it, Gerald, officially, after Gene Kuhn said, yeah, you know what, maybe we can do something. He pitched it in February of 1967. Now, the episode ended up airing on basically the last day of 1967, December 29th. So from first official pitch to on television screens across the country, it took most of a year to realize that. And that was back in 1967. TV now has a little bit faster lead-ins and scheduling, and they're scheduled within an inch of their lives. But at the time, this was probably pretty fast. His agent, Gerald's agent, who's like, oh, my client, this is great. He said, don't put it on a space station. That's probably too expensive. Why don't you just make it like a Western planet, and they can shoot at Vasquez Rocks. So the initial pitch, it was actually the Sherman's planet. Most of the action took place there on, the dusty tumbleweed, something you could go out and shoot in the Mojave Desert kind of thing. But Kuhn said, no, we like the space station. And he and DC Fontana kind of worked with Gerald. Remember, this is literally the first thing this kid's ever written. He's not coming to this as some of our other writers did with long television backgrounds in Bonanza and Big Valley and The Rifleman. And I mean, this is not some 45, 50-year-old, World War II vet who knew Gene Roddenberry and got a gig. Like, this is a fresh-faced 22-year-old kid from Chicago, Illinois, who just kind of stumbled into this and then caught the attention of the producers. So DC Fontana, after working with him, the co-showrunner with Gene Kuhn, she suggested they buy it in June. So pitched in February, actually formally write him a check in June of 1967, and then again from June to December, you had additional rewrites. He wrote the first draft of the script after getting the check in 2.5 days. And as they were working to make that script shootable, they liked, again, his enthusiasm and his efforts so much, they hired him to rewrite I, Mud, which was the second Mud episode that we saw in the original series. And we talked about I, Mud in Warp Core 47. And although, so make sure you check that out, Trekkies, and pending rebrand fans. But yes, I, Mud was, Harcourt Mudd returning, and he had the whole shrew of a wife and so forth. David Gerald got to rewrite that. He didn't get screen credit, but he was heavily involved in how that episode ended up turning out. The Tribble designs were based on one of the crew members. A woman had a fluffy key ring, and I guess somebody saw it and said, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to do these weird dragonfly, little bird-like things there. Someone saw a fuzzy key ring and said, okay. They spent $350 total to sew 500 tribbles. That's how many tribbles were ended up made for this episode. And they used synthetic fur, and they were stuffed with foam rubber. And they made a couple of them have be able to kind of move around, to give the appearance that they had motion and so forth there. In the famous scene that I'm sure you gentlemen here in the ready room will comment on, when James Kirk comes face to face with a whole fistful of tribbles, that scene took 8 takes, and that was every tribble that they had sewn. All 500 ended up being used in that iconic shot that everyone who's a Trek fan or not a Trek fan remembers that scene in that moment of James Kirk up to his eyebrows in little fuzzies. That was the whole kit and caboodle there for them. One of the cast members who really enjoyed this episode, besides William Shatner, who you could tell was just having a ball with his raised eyebrows and smirks throughout, Nichelle Nichols, as Uhura commented after the release and years later, that was one of her favorite episodes, just in terms of her importance to the storyline and just being able there. So that was one of Nichelle's favorites. And Star Trek fans responded. I mean, over the years, I think the only other show that has gotten more praise from the fandom and from critics at large and so forth would have been The City on the Edge of Forever from season 1, which we went into in great detail on Warp Core 43. So again, guys, just start the journey with us here. Go back and see prior adventures, and you will be an expert in Trek lore in no time. Eagle-eyed viewers spotted William Campbell. He was the Klingon Captain Koloff. William Campbell played Trelane in The Squire of Gothos, which we talked about in Warp Core 37. I think his Trelane role was a little showier, but the intention was Gene Roddenberry wanted Koloff to return in the 3rd season as a recurring adversary for Kirk. So this episode was supposed to set up. We learned that they kind of know each other before they even have their first scene together, and that was kind of the plan. Was he would become the face of the Klingons going forward. They never got to squeeze him into season 3, and as a result, we did not have him return after this episode. However, DS9, Rick Berman and Michael Piller picked up the ball, and William Campbell returned as Koloff in the DS9 episode Blood Oath. And so that was, if you're a Klingon fan, a DS9 fan, or just a Star Trek fan, you can spot an older but still spry William Campbell in the 1994 episode. And I'm sure we'll cover that when we head out to the Cardassian-Bajorian front lines for DS9. I also want to briefly mention Michael Pataki, who played Koloff's second-in-command Korax. He gets a showier role, actually, than William Campbell. He gets to start a fight in the bar with the Enterprise crew, so he's a lippy Klingon. And I have always liked Michael Pataki. I've always rhymed his name with Cold Six-Packy. And I remember him from a couple of 1980s sequels, coincidentally, both with the number 4 in their titles. He played the Soviet sports ambassador in Rocky IV, and he assured us when Ivan Drago was hitting things, whatever he hits, he destroys. So you'll remember him and his eyebrows. And he also played a doctor who clashed swords with Donald Pleasance in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, insisting that Michael Myers would never break free of his restraints and terrorize Haddonfield again. And we all know how that happened in the first 10 minutes. So he wasn't a very good practicing physician. But he was Michael Pataki, and it was nice to see him in one of his earlier roles here. Gentlemen, the episode is on the light side, and that sometimes has worked to Trek's benefit and sometimes to its detriment. Setting aside the warm fuzzies that it has engendered over the years, how does a cold, clear-eyed look from the 21st century, look back on December 29th, 1967, what do modern eyes say about the trouble with tribbles?
Well, it's no tribble at all. I mean, it holds up. It holds up extraordinarily well. And I think that's why Blood Oath in DS9 was so successful. Not just because of Dax, of course, who really elevated that series, but I really, revisiting this episode, and I've watched it hundreds of times probably. I mean, I love this episode. It's still really good, even like watching it, looking for flaws. Other than the fact that they say Klingon and Klingonese, you pick up on little things like that where it's just, oh, that's kind of goofy, but it's really kind of like endearing. Like this whole episode, I know it's supposed to be comedic, but it sets up like Kirk and the Klingons having a thing, not liking each other. You get some of the fun little hijinks, I think, of later 60s TV. There's a little absurdity to it. Uhura plays a really excellent role. Not to mention Mr. Scott. I mean, in this episode, Scotty is just James Doohan. I mean, we could go on and on about how James Doohan kind of gets the shaft in this series because he's the finest actor, really, truly, on this show, probably. Not only is he the oldest cast member, but he really brings gravitas to every single scene he's in. Even when he's like trying to dodge, like, well, I threw the first punch. he comes across as so, like, I don't know. You just inherently trust him. He's legitimately like a leader amongst the crew, and you can tell why he's in the position he's in. And this is really the first time I think we sort of get the shades of who Scotty is through the movies and later in the series. And I think the next episode too really highlights that as well. Is that this is the Mr. Scott we kind of know and love. Even though, in the movies, he's sort of relegated to the I'm Mr. Scott and I do the goofy Mr. Scott type things. It really comes across as just genuine. I mean, it's something that I really noticed this watch through is that it's like, when I think of Mr. Scott, it's this episode and Star Trek IV that I think of. Like, those are the two things that stick out. And just his love for the Enterprise, more so than anything, is just so crystal clear, which is great. Not to mention the fact that you get the some of the best tropes of the Star Trek series. You get the overly annoying, administrative guy who's trying to order around Kirk, and Kirk's not having it because, to hell with the administrative side of things. And you get the goofy, like, I demand you do this. Okay, we're going to do the absolute bare minimum just to shut you up. And, and of course you get the Klingons who, I think this kind of sows the seed of what Klingons become later on, in a goofy way, but it's really there. They have sort of this notion of honor, right? They respect Kirk, but at the same time, like, they're going to take pot shots at Kirk. Just like in every iteration of Klingons afterwards, there's sort of this weird respect level with Captain Kirk and the Enterprise and, like, the ingenuity of Kirk. But at the same time, they're like, but we're still going to come after you because you're the prize. For every headhunting Klingon out there, I look at Krug, I want Kirk. If I'm going to have a chance to take out Kirk, I'm going to go for it. And this is sort of like, it's not directly hitting on that, but it definitely kind of tips the scales in that direction in a way where it's like, maybe it's this tribble prank that they play on the Klingons that kind of pushes them towards hating Kirk just that much more. And not to mention, like, the effects are so, like, practical and simple that it really doesn't run into some of the issues like the carpet monster that we see in season is it early in season 2 or season 1? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Devil in the Dark, season 1, yeah.
Yeah, you don't get some of those goofy special effects problems because it literally is just like fur on foam rubber. So that's something that, you're not laughing at it like a, computer animated Kirk face in, Star Trek 4 as they're slingshotting around the sun. 30 years later, that doesn't hold up very well. But these tribbles hold up just fine. And, I think you get enough of the whole crew where you sort of feel good about everything. And you get the banter between Spock and McCoy, which is just, again, it's setting up these classic relationships. I mean, we've talked about fundamental episodes of Star Trek before. But if ever there was the cornerstone, the absolute keystone to Star Trek, the original series, it's Trouble with Tribbles, hands down. And no better episode to do so than one essentially written by a fan.
Right.
Which, anybody out there who writes or enjoys fan fiction, you shouldn't feel bad about that, because this episode absolutely justifies fan fiction.
Agreed.
It'd be nice if they would have taken the stunt coordinator from this episode and brought them to the following episode, which we will get to, because at least the fights were a little bit better in this one.
But I mean, amazingly long. Like this fight sequence, I'm just like Pevney's like, you just keep going. He's just like.
So here's what you have to ask yourself too: you walk into a bar and you know you're going to get into it. Maybe even a bar in Baldwin, Michigan. Who knows? Who do you take with you? Do you take Captain Kirk, or are you taking Scott? you got to think about that. Who's gonna be able to rough it up the most in a situation like that? Because we get a pretty tough bar fighting Scotty here in this episode, and to Urza's point, as always, we always talk about how much Kirk loves that ship, and obviously, we're seeing Scotty have that same type of love, and maybe it's even from a different perspective, right? Because he's the one that is taking care of the internals of this ship. It's almost like he's the doctor and the caretaker, and that's where
soul.
That's where that love is coming from. I told both of you my only slight issue. We've talked about this with Spock before, not having to have we don't want the forced Spock comedy, and the only thing, like, this episode pulls off all the comedy, little funny things here and there, and again, I guess it's a 60s thing. You don't need the campy music to sell the joke. The jokes are selling themselves, but again, that time period, that's probably what they had to do. But, a little bit of intrigue, a lot of comedy. These are the episodes, too, that could go south very easily. We've talked about those as well. Like, you could have screwed this one up big time. Some furry little, or some little ball of fur can mess up an entire station and infect a ship in a sense. And it goes off without a hitch. So, yeah. Great episode.
I do want to say, and it's not going to, I don't think, negatively impact my final prognostication here, but piggybacking on your point there, Lord Uther, the times, Stanley Adams, who plays Cyrano Jones, the prospector who first introduces us to Tribbles, he was encouraged or not discouraged from playing it very broad. Even broader than Harcourt, Fenton Mudd, and so forth. And I'm willing to overlook some of it, again, because I think that he was supposed to be the jester and the clown, and that's a classic narrative trope that I understand. But if I had been Joseph Pevney, I'm not sure I wouldn't have asked him to take it down 20%. Because, there's just, especially in that bar fight, a lot of goofy mugging, and, it was almost signaling, oh, look, it's funny, you laugh, as opposed to, again, letting it be more authentic and organic and natural. I
actually thought it was Harry Mudd at first.
It very well could have been. Honestly, this could have been a third Mudd.
He was dressed like him. He was dressed like him too, which was the other thing that kind of threw me off. I'm like, wait a minute, I think this was Harry Mudd. But yeah. Anyway,
And
go.
I think the whole Chekhov thing. I love that he's youthful. I don't know how much more we'll get going forward on our 5-year journey, which gets shortened to 3 years. But tying everything back to Russia, it's like I get it now. It's a nice recurring bit, but a little of that can go a long way. And I love, I mean, the setup to the bar fight, which lasts, I mean, easily 3 or 4 minutes, which is like, wow, you know, that's you're just saying to yourself, are they going to break every piece of furniture in that bar? The setup, it takes a long time for Scotty's fuse to finally get lit. Korax, you know, is taunting them, Kirk, and he's a space worm and a slug, and you know, and I just love Scott, easy laddie, you know, telling Chekhov, who's ready to go right there. He's like, you know, and then when he says the Enterprise is a garbage scow, he's, would you care to rephrase that? And then just throws it. And Kirk, I mean, again, we were talking about Shatner having fun with the episode as he's basically trying to get from, you know, Scotty, who threw the first punch, and, you know, Doohan's avoiding it. And when it finally comes out, like the look on Kirk's face when he realizes, well, this didn't start because you were defending your captain and all the stuff he would, you know, he says, well, what did he say about me? Well, he called you a Dilithian space worm, sir. But that's not why we, you know, we're fighting, really. Well, you know, yeah, he called the Enterprise a garbage scow. And then Kirk, like, his ego gets pricked just enough in there, and Shatner, you know, sells that with the, oh, I understand now. Like, and I don't know how to respond to that. It was those two, that scene, just lift it out of the show and just show it to future acting classes or writing classes or so forth. It was really, 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 really well done there. So, yeah, so a little less Cyrano Jones, you know, shameless mugging. And where's Sulu, right? Well, we'll talk about that when we cover our next Warp Core episode. You won't want to miss that, but there is an answer as to why George Takei was mysteriously absent while the Tribbles were overrunning the bridge and the corridors and eating Captain Kirk's chicken sandwich and coffee. That really ticked him off when he went to get lunch and instead had slightly warm Tribble on the tray.
Like I always said, I think there was more coffee that was consumed in this series than Twin Peaks. And that's saying something.
Yes.
Yeah. Who knew there'd be so much coffee drinking in space? I'd like to ask the astronauts who undoubtedly watch the Warp Core podcast, those of you out there who've been on the International Space Station, especially, how much coffee do you drink in space? And is it out of those little Dixie cups? Because I'm jealous, not going to lie, although Suntory Boss Coffee is the boss of them all since 1992. And tell you what, just as refreshing. But, gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and kick off our Warp Core ratings because I don't think it's any mystery how I feel about this episode. This is a Warp Core breach for me. It's a 7.5 out of 7. I think it is the perfect episode of Star Trek, and it gets better with age. That puts it just over the bar for me at a 7.5 out of 7 because, honestly, the more I watch it, the more I love it. I would think by this time, with as goofy and campy as it can be, I would have maybe a different opinion or maybe a slightly less enthusiastic reaction, but every single rewatch of this episode, I find something more and more that I like about it. And I really like the idea that this could have been a Harry Mudd episode. I do think it may have fit very well, especially since they wanted to make Harry Mudd sort of a recurring villain-ish type character. I think that would have been a lot of fun, but I'm fully satisfied with everything in this episode. It is the penultimate Star Trek episode, and absolutely, if you have not seen the original series or any Star Trek, this is the first episode, above all, you should watch.
I'll go next. To me, it's a 7 as well. Fitting into my shirt I have never been able to fit into before. So that's for a whole nother episode, though, of one of our wonderful podcasts that you can catch here on Pending Rebrand, whether it's Melt Off Mondays, Warp Core Wednesdays, or Force Fridays. We have everything for you here. Yes, 7 for me. Even though there was a little campy music that all of you know I enjoy so much. This is just classic Trek. This might even be an episode you could show to a younger generation that might get them hooked a little bit to see these little furry things on the screen that can cause such trouble. They are tribbles. So there we go.
Who am I to argue with generations of Trek fans, critics, and the like, gentlemen? And I'm too old to have breaches now as I get up there in years. But I will go with a solid 7, and I will forgive Cyrano Jones a little bit of shameless Jim Carrey style mugging in this episode. I think we talk about being able to show it to non-Trek fans or people who are not as invested in the mythology and the canon and so forth. I think it's because David Gerald, with the help of the producers and so forth, I think it says basically everything it needs to say about who these characters are to each other. Who are Spock and McCoy and Kirk and Scotty and Uhura and Chekhov. Like, they're fully formed relationships in just 50 minutes of television. So it is the perfect standalone introduction episode because you understand watching this one chapter that everything you kind of need to know about this crew and how they relate and care about each other is reflected all the way back to the man trap and so on and so forth. So it's a perfect, literally ship in a bottle episode, not because it's in a self-contained location, but because this says everything you need to say. And if you only watch that one episode, you'd get classic Trek. Like this is an episode that gives us fully formed relationships that we can understand and empathize with, and while at the same time giving us this wacky, they're eating too much grain, Captain, episode, so forth. So it's the best episode to ever feature overeating extraterrestrials munching on synthesized grain, wheat. So 7 out of 7, baby.
Wonderful. And as we move forward into the next Warp Core podcast, we will leave you with the ever popular Live Long and Prosper.